Welcome back, everybody. This morning, as I was getting ready, I heard a news story on NPR about a renaming ceremony for an Army base in Virginia that used to be known by the name of a Confederate general. But yesterday, it was renamed Fort Gregg Adams to honor two Black Army pioneers. Lieutenant General Arthur Gregg, who was the first Black lieutenant general in the Army and rose to the rank of a three-star general during his more than three-decade career in the military, and Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams, who served as the first Black officer in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and she served in Europe during World War II. Lieutenant General Gregg was in attendance, and he's in his 90s, and he spoke at the ceremony yesterday. And he said, I hope that this community will look with pride on the name Fort Gregg Adams, and that the name will instill pride in every soldier entering our mighty gates. And so that struck a chord with me as I was getting dressed. And I know our panels today are also ready to do some gate opening of their own. So I am eager to turn it over to Dr. Bhamathi Viswanathan to introduce the first panel. And we're very proud at SIP Squared to claim Dr. Viswanathan as one of our affiliated scholars at SIP Squared. Professor Viswanathan is currently a faculty fellow at New England Law, and she has several years of teaching experience at diverse schools. And those include Williams College, University of Pennsylvania Law School, and most recently Emerson College and Roger Williams University Law School. I'll let you read the rest of her impressive experience in the conference program so that she can get on with her introduction. And also the panel bios are in the conference program. But I just want to say, as I did yesterday, I'm so excited that all of the panelists are joining us, all of the speakers are joining us, and I am thrilled to have all of you in attendance for this fantastic program and the fantastic speakers. So Bhamathi, it's all yours.
Wow. This is going to be mutual thanks session here, Sandra, because I first want to start, of course, with a huge thank you to Sean O'Connor, Sandra A. Stars, and all of those who made this conference both imagined and real. Of course, to the inimitable pair of Christina Pietro and Mary Claire Duvel, to Joshua Kresh, and to all of those behind the scenes, including, of course, our incredible planning committee, whose many hands lifting made this manageable and rewarding, but especially manageable. So thank you all. And I've got an incredible panel here. I think one of our panelists is having a little bit of internet connection, so bear with me. Maybe you can listen to me for a couple minutes while we hopefully bring him on board. Because this is a really critical moment in IP, I think, and it's a difficult one, it's a fraught one. And I wanna just lay the background for about 10 minutes or so. I will try really hard not to exceed my time here because you want to hear from our wonderful panelists, not me. But I think we need to sketch in a little bit of background for those of us who aren't as familiar with where we're coming from and where we're hopefully going. So there's been a lot of inquiry into IP lately as to whether or not its functioning is really as sort of neutral and fair as it seems, right? So many scholars, certainly not all, would argue that the mainstays of IP, copyright, trademark, patent, and so forth, right, can appear neutral on their face and in their initial form, right? But ultimately, oh, here's our panelists, wonderful, we're set, okay. So now I have to talk faster, great. I'm a New Yorker, I can do that. Ultimately, where we're going with this idea of neutral on its face becomes murky, right? It starts to become clear to many of us that the way in which IP is wielded, its way, what it calls property, what it gives protection, rewards to, benefits, can land very differently on very different populations of creators and innovators. And the effect on an individual case, on one person, one creator, one innovator, can be pernicious enough, right? Your work can be denied protection, can be denied the privilege of intellectual properties, benefits, its bundle, as we call them sometimes, of rights, right? But the cumulative effects can be even more devastating. Entire groups of creators and innovators can be left out in the cold, disenfranchised, unrewarded, unconsidered. And just as in cases of individual disenfranchisement, you add those up together in the long-term society effects, the larger scale effects We've seen this with capital. We've seen this with land or goods amassment. Massive unequal distribution of the goodies can lead to intergenerational divergences, to problems, to inequities that become pretty much insurmountable over time. And the broad effects of IP's gatekeeping can result in systemic, perpetuated injustice. All right, so let me just give you a quick idea of how this can work. And I know our panelists are going to go into this in much richer and more important detail, but let me just give you an idea, right? Copyright's requirement of fixation. Copyright says a work must be fixed in a tangible medium to garner copyright. Well, that sounds kind of neutral. Fix it, you get it. It turns out that when this is deployed, fixation is not always nearly as neutral as it seems. So what kind of works are left out? Improvisational works, collective works, collaborative works. There's also the question of authorship back there that those of you who are copyright people know lurks as well with its jaws agape. I'm terrible at metaphors. I always take them far too far, right? But beneath the surface, there are a lot of strings to copyright that leave out certain forms of expression, certain groups of people that express themselves creatively, imaginatively, innovatively, all the things we think of as IP worthy, but their work isn't recognized by intellectual property. And I'll just give you one gigantic example that's been looked at by so many scholars, Professors Casey Green, Funmi Arewa, Professor Votz right here. So many people have said, look, African-American music, blues, improvisation, ragtime, jazz. Fixation, not so much. Traditional forms of creation, dance, collaborative work, traditional communities works, local communities, indigenous works, work done by women, sewing, cooking, fashion, some forms of dance. The scope of copyright protection can include them. So we've got fixation, we've got authorship, we've got scope, we've got so many areas. All those words sound neutral on their face. How they play out, how they're deployed really varies. And we have an incredibly rich body of literature. And Professor Votz right here is one of the leading voices in that. We're so grateful to have her and all of you here, because these voices are coming up and saying, look, we need to think about this more closely. BIPOC community, indigenous peoples, LGBTQIA+ communities, women, the groups we heard from yesterday. So many whose identities have been marginalized by the structures of law, and so many who have seen these greater socioeconomic systems embedding, enforcing inequities. And this is an extraordinary tapestry of work that we're beginning to see. This panel is going to touch on that, and I'm unbelievably moved and excited that we're doing that. So we're talking in part about this gatekeeping. What makes this complicated is that sometimes even within the gates, there can be fights, even outside the gates, between communities. How do women, we talk about intersectionality, it's a term that I adore and I use a lot, especially when I teach, right? But the other side of intersectionality, where groups come together and see varying parts of their identity work together, is also divisiveness within communities. What happens when one group is benefited to the detriment of another? It might be different groups of women, it might be different races, it might be different groups. We get torn sometimes in these discussions. That makes it even more complicated when we start talking about how do we open the gates? And what are the gate openers? These are daunting odds. These are historic, deeply rooted shortcomings. How do we reconfigure IP to make it fairer and more hospitable to people who haven't been brought within its purview? Those are the questions we're going to be raising and asking today. And they're huge questions. And I'm going to raise them and I'm going to ask our panelists to answer them all in less than 40 minutes. That's not going to happen, of course, but we're going to try to tackle some of them, because underneath this is a substratum of questions that are big and deep and important. One of them is, okay, can we reconfigure IP itself? How do we reconfigure to make it fair, more hospitable? Do we need to scrap IP altogether? There are scholars who just say, burn down the house. That's it. Let's just try a new whole new system. Do we find IP analogs, which is one of the main themes of this conference? Norms, new ways of securing rights and recognition and protection, new ways of configuring intellectual property. Is there a way that we could create a world in which agreed upon norms, collaboration-centric work, and expansion of rights based in recognition, dignity, other practices that are based on a richer understanding of creative and innovative expression and exchange. Can those become the standard? And should those stand with, or should they supplant, or should they substitute for, or somehow otherwise interact with intellectual property? And the broadest question behind all this is, can we use this critical process of IP examination to help achieve gender and racial equity, equality? Can we re-engineer IP to promote distributive justice? Is that the project before us? I would submit to you all that that is at least part of, an important part of the project before us, but I'm only a very tiny part of this story. The panels before you have been working in this area for so long and are so richly steeped in these questions that I want to open up their voices to you because I think they'll be incredibly illuminating. I'm just in awe of all of them collectively and individually. So let me introduce them to you very briefly and then we will proceed. Our last arrival in Zoom order is Dr. Eden Sarid, who is a lecturer at the University of Essex and director of their IP and Law and Technology Research Cluster. His research and teaching interests include intellectual property, land law, law and technology, and cultural heritage law. Dr. Sarid's current research focuses on creative subcultures that deviate from traditional intellectual property models, queer analysis of intellectual property and private law doctrines, and artificial intelligence and its impact on administrative decision-making. Professor Jordana Goodman joins us from Boston University School of Law. Hi, neighbor. She is the visiting clinical assistant professor at the BU MIT Technology Law Clinic. Her research focuses on gender and race equity issues in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM, concentrating on intellectual property ownership and recognition as advancement tools for systemically underrepresented people in STEM fields. And my apologies, Dr. Goodman, I always have a tendency to go deep into copyright lore, and I forget that patent is an incredibly important part of this story, so you will foreground that for us. Thanks for doing the work I don't really know how to do. Professor Anjali Vats is Associate Professor of Law with a secondary appointment in communications at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Her book, The Color of Creatorship, Intellectual Property, Race, and the Making of Americans, as well as her extensive writings on critical race IP, are widely considered essential readings in the field. And by the way, always assigned in my courses. Just want you to know that, Professor Vats. Those royalty streams are really like coming from me. Professor Lauren Mulrain is Professor of Law and the Director of Music and Entertainment Law Studies at Belmont University College of Law. I can't even begin to tell you all he's written about music and law, but I can definitely say from having read him for a very long time that every word of his is both enjoyable and illuminating. So what a panel we have, what an embarrassment of riches. And with no further ado, I'm going to jump into this. And Christina, I believe, is going to take us away with the CLE word, the all-important CLE word. Go, Christina. You're on mute, my friend.
You'd think by now. I'm back with the CLE. The panel 3 CLE code, in keeping with our beautiful spring flower theme, is pansy. The code is pansy, and I'll paste it in the chat.
Lovely. Thanks, Christina. I'm going to go I'm going to start with patent because I did it a disservice and I'm still feeling guilty about that. I'm going to start with Professor Goodman, who's going to bring us into the world of patent law, which only here in a panel like this could it even be put in like an ancillary position to copyright, since we're usually the ones called the soft IP. But today, Professor Goodman, you will have the stage for the first 7 minutes and we will go from there. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and to present with so many people who are dealing with these issues across intellectual property. So I'm here to talk about cultural issues with respect to patents. And so I want to kind of take a step back and just talk about how do we get a patent? The general premise of how, let's say, a first-time inventor gets a patent is they come up with an idea. They figure out a way not necessarily to reduce that idea to practice or some kind of equivalent of a fixed medium, not required in patents, but they figure out a way essentially to be able to teach another person of ordinary skill in the art, called a fauceta, person having ordinary skill in the art, how to make and use their invention. And that invention has to be novel and not obvious, again, to that fictional person of ordinary skill in the art. Once that happens, usually they'll go to a patent attorney, or maybe they might file on their own, which has quite a few issues in and of itself in terms of access to attorneys and legal justice, which I'm not going to get into now. But then they go to the patent office. The patent office then examines this application in light of the subject matter in which it is categorized, and decides from there whether things that already exist make this not obvious. Things that already exist make it so that there's enough written description for this person to get a patent. And usually they'll go back and forth a little bit until somebody eventually gets a patent or the patent is abandoned. Now, of course, it's a really scary process for a first-time inventor. You've created this invention, it's kind of your baby, and you want to make sure that this gets through the patent process as easily as possible so that you get the broadest patent protection for the work that you've done. And so you rely on everyone else to kind of guide you through that process, including your attorney. And so the first thing that I want to explain is something that's going to be in a later paper of mine that says that a person having ordinary skill in the art, if that's decided by certain categories in the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and those categories were created years ago, likely the default is the average practitioner in that field, which means in cases of things like hair care, where the majority of hair care workers in this country are white, the average is white. That can be a really big problem for people whose cultural background informs their invention, and for people who they're then going to explain that invention to in the hopes of getting a patent. The second issue is also that they need to have somebody who is going to guide them through and understand what is obvious to whoever that person of ordinary skill in the art is, which means that attorney is going to need to really bear the burden of doing this translation from somebody who is an inventor to whoever that average person is and understand the cultural implications therein. That doesn't happen. And so this is the story that I'm going to discuss is two inventors that I found over the course of my research who work in Black hair care. So I don't know if anybody knows what this is. This is a hair sponge. Brigitte Goupeau and Bruce Boyd created this in 2004. And basically what happens is for people who have very curly hair, usually Black individuals, but other individuals can also have 4A to 4C hair. What you do is you put a little bit of gel or styling product in your hair, and then you use this around your hair to twist and twist and twist, and it can start dreads, or a style that can be used for very short hair that could mimic at least the start of dreadlocks and have this curly hairstyle. That hairstyle used to take hours because it used to be twisted by hand. It's done in a matter of minutes. And I understand that kind of sounds like an infomercial, but what's important about this is the communication aspect of this, because these inventors who are Black tried to find a patent attorney who understood their invention. And they ended up defaulting to somebody who they ended up working out with in a gym, because he said that he could give him the best discount and a good barter of services in order to get the cheapest patent protection possible. Turns out over the course of patent prosecution, they didn't really get a good deal. Not only was the patent written in a way that really wasn't respectful, in that the attorney referred to this not as twisting your hair, but clumping your hair. But once it got to the patent office, because they used the word hair sponge, it got categorized as a cleaning product. And in so doing, it's getting rejected off of deodorants, and it's getting rejected off of cleaning body sponges. It's made of an entirely different material than a body sponge. It's made of an entirely different material than a cleaning product. But because of the title and because of the lack of knowledge at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and the lack of really cultural understanding of what this is, as well as even a subject matter that could fit this, this is going to be miscategorized because there is no correct category for this. The problem is we don't have an attorney now who can bridge that gap. We don't have attorneys who are acknowledging this, and they end up not getting a patent on the product itself. They only got a patent on the method, which means every time they go to court, and they have been successful in court, but they can't prevent as many knockoffs as they should be able to because this patent prosecution process wasn't built for them. And so it's important to just understand over the course of this work that there's a lack of cultural competence that exists in an attorney. There's a lack of cultural understanding that's built into the patent process. And these are two very different things and very different ways that we can fix it. I think as an educator, it's really important for me to help our students understand that they can put client voices first. And hopefully with this greater understanding, we can fix some of the cultural understanding and mismatch that occurred here. But that's not going to solve our entire problem. Because if we have FOSITA, who's default white, we're never going to have equal access to the patent system, even if we have people who really understand this. And so I'm teaching my students how to bridge that gap in their patent prosecution process. But the next step is to really look if we can do some intersectional work and perhaps even welcome in sociologists and anthropologists into the patent office so that when we have this written description issue, we have people who can evaluate the patent on a neutral basis and say, actually, the reason why this person isn't getting a fair shot is because this is a cultural invention and not because they had a lack of understanding of the invention when they submitted it. So that's my next project, and I really appreciate the time to speak on this.
That was awesome. Thank you, Professor Goodman. And Sandra, an email, hi Sandra, says in the comments, this is a great example of the lack of cultural competence, and I could not possibly agree more. I talked about the, facially neutral terms. You're talking about a facially neutral process that turns out not to be neutral at all. Very perfect tie in. Also, you've taught me that you should not hit up people in your gym for advice, which is a good thing to know because I go to the gym a lot. So I got a lesson learned there.
Number one takeaway from this.
Number one takeaway.
Don't hit up the patent attorney at your gym unless they really understand what they're talking about.
Yeah, and conversely, they keep asking me for legal advice. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. I've learned so much. Professor Sareed, can you take us away, please? Because I'm excited to hear your analysis.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for including me, and what a great lineup and such great conversation so far. So I want to start with the organizing idea of what a queer analysis of IP is, where it starts from and where it goes. Because, all these words, are some of them are buzzwords, but really it is good to kind of go back to the fundamentals and understand where we're at. So the organizing idea, if you like, is that intellectual property, and we heard this already earlier today, doesn't simply affect the cultural goods that we consume or that we produce, but it actually creates a political, social, and economic order. It affects our well-being, our personal health, our wealth, the people we share our communities with, ideas, such a rich world, not just what you will see on TV or what you'll read tomorrow in the papers. And this is kind of the organizing idea and where this whole kind of investigation starts from. And it asks us to ask ourselves a few very simple questions. The first would be, what are the conventions or the norms that structure our cultural order? How and why they have become the convention? Why are they the norm? And very importantly, how can we as a community, researchers, academics, practitioners, reveal them, these kind of conventions, and their social, economic, and political impact on our lives, on our society, on the world that we share? So there are various critical approaches to intellectual property. We heard earlier, we'll hear more later about different angles, starting from feminist perspectives, gendered perspective, post-colonial political background, personal economic background, and reflecting kind of critically through these lenses exposes IP's role as a gatekeeper, but, and this is something I'm going to touch on later, also its potential as a gate opener. And we'll talk together about what can be done in that regard. So taking us from these kind of critical approaches into particularly queer analysis, I know we are all, of course, what queer analysis is, but I'll also give you kind of a snapshot. Queer analysis tells us that it is important to explore IP from different perspectives, and queer analysis is particularly focused on the performance of gender and on sexuality. Queer analysis basically or queer theory comes from the humanities. It is a methodology that aims at revealing and disrupting institutions, conventions, and narratives that are centered around sexuality and identity, and how certain identities and certain sexualities are foregrounded and rewarded in our everyday lives and in our institutions, and particularly in IP. So a queer analysis of IP would investigate how IP norms, IP doctrines, practices, even the vocabulary that we use in intellectual property language really structures and generates certain normativities, certain behaviors, certain gender performances, and certain sexualities in social production. And it asks, what are the results of these norms, these practices, these vocabularies on citizenship, on communities, on belonging, and on access to culture and the ability to share culture? My main argument in looking at intellectual property from a queer perspective, from a queer analysis, is that IP doctrine, vocabulary, common practices foreground heteronormativity and hegemonic gender stylization. When I say heteronormativity, is this kind of traditional way that we see what a family should be, what a person should be, what an identity is, what a person's performance in public should look like. And this all translates into cultural production. And it creates, again, a certain type of goods that are available to us, that we share, that we can access. And this channels us into a certain hierarchy. There are certain creators that are awarded over other creators. There are certain creations that are considered better or more important to protect than other types of creation. There are certain requirements in the law that really create substantial barriers for people who want to partake in culture because of their sexuality, because of the way they perform their gender, because of the way they express themselves. And this, of course, has huge implications for where they are or where they fit in popular culture, in mainstream culture, in society, in our economic order, in our social order. And just kind of like reverse engineering this into intellectual property sometimes can be super, kind of surprising for us, because we tend to think of intellectual property as something so neutral, right? All you need to do is subject matter, fixation, these kind of very, very neutral things. Well, queer analysis tells us these are not as neutral as we think. Actually, they're not neutral at all. So I want to kind of give a few very quick examples just to kind of give a more concrete understanding of what it is I'm talking about. Let's take copyright subject matter, for example, and this is something that Bamir already mentioned to us earlier. Certain creative expressions attract copyright, others don't. So if I'm an architect or I'm a writer or I'm a filmmaker, I can obtain a copyright in my work or a trademark if I have a certain name for my brand or something like that. But a seamstress or a cook or traditional feminine, again, I'm using this kind of as a form of expression, don't attract copyright. Why? Is there something more important to society about innovation and about creativity in the kitchen? About innovation and creativity, say in architecture or in writing, and not in the kitchen, not in needlework? Why do we foreground this and not that? And again, when we ask ourselves why, we need to ask ourselves, should we? So that would be kind of the next step, taking this forward. And then we need to ask ourselves, what kind of cultural citizenship does this create? Who belongs where? Why do we foreground, for example, something like, a book, a film, but not these kind of communal creative circles that, do needlework together or do other cultural expressions, which are extremely important for certain communities. And again, what does this later reflect on the way that our society is constructed and built? Another example, again, which we spoke about earlier, has to do with fixation and this divide, this dichotomy between the private and the public domain. We love to say certain things belong in the public domain. They are public. They are, that's where they should be, or that's where they should belong, and some things are private. And this dichotomy, again, works really well towards certain populations, certain groups, and not so much towards other. And this is particularly influential when it comes to queer creativity. So queer spaces or queer communities really focus on the community, on communal creation together, are not classifying what they do, and definitely not, fixing things in material form. They don't go to the gym to ask their instructor what to do with what they create, and that might be a problem because, again, it's a matter of accessibility and a matter of how they conceive their creativity. And I think this doesn't only mean that they don't get to copyright what they create. It only means that it also means that it is easy to take what they create and appropriate and privatize it. And I'll give an example that many of you know. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Madonna's song Vogue, Voguing. We all know this song. We love this song. I dance to this song. It's a great song. But where does voguing come from? Voguing is a queer, Black, Latinx form of expression which was created communally and not fixed. Madonna comes, she loves, gay culture, that's okay. She sees this song, she writes lyrics, writes music to it, brings in queer dances to do her, her little kind of musical work with it. And then it is privatized. And now if a queer community wants to dance to this in a queer, ball in Harlem, they actually need to license it from Madonna, who is a cisgender white woman. So this again shows us not only that you can't copyright this, but how vulnerable this community is to appropriation of what they create. Again, queer analysis lets us think about these things and what it means for our shared culture. A third point, IP vocabulary. So do we ever wonder why we call IP protection? Who are we protecting from? Are we protecting those who create? Are we protecting a certain group? And who are those big people that we need to protect the creations against? Again, using these kind of categories of protection tells us a huge story about what IP achieves, not just in terms of what can be copyright and what cannot be copyright, but again, who belongs and who doesn't. We protect, again, the author, the architecture against who? And the people who use these things, are they pirates? Are they free writers? Who is the free writer? Is Madonna a free writer? She's not a free writer. She's an author. She's protected. She gets IP. She gets copyright for her song. But actually, she's a free writer. She free rides on a queer, creative, Black Latinx community's creation. So why are we categorizing these things in this way? So really, again, a queer analysis would ask us to open our minds to think about the vocabulary that we use as well. And when we think about the vocabulary, we also need to think about how we label these different groups, different individuals, in terms of what they create. So these are kind of the main three examples that I want to talk about, subject matter, fixation, and private-public domain dichotomy, and IP vocabulary. But I do want to finish with this thought-provoking idea that I had as I was doing my research, and kind of connects to the theme of today when we talk about gatekeeping and gate opening. One of the interesting things about IP I learned by interviewing and talking to queer communities of practice, queer creators, is that resistance to IP is also an important form of creative expression. Some of these groups, some of these individuals see opposing IP, taking works from mainstream culture and reusing them in their creativity is an important part of what they do. And explicitly saying, I oppose the law, I contradict or I fight IP to make it a different or a better or a more inclusive or whatever you want to call it, legal regime, is also an important part of creativity. So when we think about how we want to structure IP, we also need to kind of open our minds to thinking about these types of themes. Thank you very much. I look forward to our discussions today.
That's incredibly rich. Thank you so much, Professor Suri. There is so much there. Your Madonna Vogue example made me think, of course, of one of my favorite movies, Paris is Burning, but it also made me think of TikTok dances and the struggle that African-American creators have had in the realm of dance, which is something that we sadly cannot go off on, because I could spend an hour on that alone. But I think your final point, that resistance to IP can itself be a form of creativity, is a really interesting trope. I don't think it's universally shared, but I think it's also a really important strategy to foreground and to understand, particularly when people do that they're doing it deliberately as a choice, and that we understand that as a form of speech, a form of creative speech. And that's a beautiful point. And it also is a beautiful point to use as a segue to Professor Watts, who I believe will have so many wonderful things to say about that and more. So Professor Watts, thank you so much for taking the stage.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I actually have some slides. I'm going to see if this share screen works here. I just want to start by actually saying thank you to everybody for having me, and particularly to the Center for Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy, to Sandra Estars for inviting me, to Sean O'Connor, Joshua Kresh, Mary Claire DeVell, Christina Pietro, of course, Bhamati Viswanathan, and the panelists. It's such a pleasure to be here, and the Boston folks on the panel are making me miss Boston a little bit. So this is actually a talk I originally gave in Boston like 6 or 7 years ago, and it's one of those papers that it's not quite fully cooked yet, but I want to touch on some of these points because I think they're relevant to what we're talking about today. So essentially I'm going to be talking about the emotional politics of intellectual property, or how gatekeeping is a national trauma response. So there are a lot of conversations right now about two things, both in academia and I think in popular culture writ large. One of them is affect or affect theory. How do emotions essentially drive politics? How do they drive decision making? And how do they sort of short circuit what we've all been taught to believe is the core of decision making, which is logic, right? So that's one thing I want to talk about, emotions as drivers of intellectual property. The second thing I want to talk about is trauma, and what trauma is, right? And you may have heard the phrase trauma responses, or trauma-informed teaching, or trauma-informed therapy. These are ideas that I think are getting a lot of buy-in and discussion right now because they focus on why we behave the way that we do, and how some of those patterned responses are less conscious than we might like them to be. So essentially what I want to do is take those two frameworks of emotions and trauma and think about how they shape intellectual property, and particularly gatekeeping in intellectual property. And I'm going to build on Professor Goodman's work and also Professor Sareed's talk in terms of the concepts that I'm going to talk about. So gatekeeping is a means of keeping people in or out at base. It is I think evident in intellectual property in cases, pretty classic copyright cases such as SunTrust Bank versus Houghton Mifflin, which you'll recall is the Gone with the Wind case that involved a quote unquote parody of that book. And most classically, Warner Brothers versus Grand Upright Music, when the judge in that case started with this phrase, "Thou shalt not steal," in dealing with Biz Marquis's sampling. Essentially, I want to start with those two cases as exemplars of how intellectual property gatekeeping operates through processes of carcerality. So if you have been following conversations about policing, about abolition, and so on, you may have heard this phrase carcerality, but essentially that focuses on a critique. It focuses our attention to critiques of punishment and why critiques of punishment are problematic. And so what I want to introduce here is the idea that intellectual property as a structure is fundamentally built around carcerality. It's fundamentally built around ideas of gatekeeping. And that the examples that Professor Goodman, that Professor Sareed provided are further evidence of how carcerality, of how discipline is the mechanism through which intellectual property operates. So in this sense, carcerality and its attendant punishment are produced through the mobilization, I would argue, of public feelings. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of this. But those public feelings include fear, rage, anxiety, and resentment. And those are not the most positive valenced feelings for cooperation, for collaboration, for inclusion. So thinking about intellectual property as policy only misses parts of the picture. It misses the fact that the movement of emotion, i.e. pathos, if we think in Aristotelian terms, not logos, drives decision making. And so until we address that underlying emotion that's driving intellectual property, I think there's going to be an impulse to gatekeeping on both sides. And that's, I think, not specific to any group of people. It is specific to the structure that we have been offered to address the problem of ownership and fairness. So the questions I want to ask are, what are the affective or emotional origin stories of intellectual property, building on Jessica Silby's work on the origin stories of intellectual property? How do they keep us tied to a politics of carcerality, which is fundamentally gatekeeping in nature, instead of politics of liberation, which I would argue is gate opening? So here's a picture of the now late Bismarcky in that landmark case. This is a very different person, Jack Valenti, and I want to give two examples that I think span copyright, trademark, patent, and focus on how intellectual property, very different areas of intellectual property, are animated by the same emotional politics. So here's a quote from Jack Valenti from 1982, when he testified in the hearings before the Subcommittee on Court Civil Liberties and the Administration of Justice of the Committee on the Judiciary. And he says the single one American-made product that the Japanese, skilled beyond comparison in their conquest of world trade, are unable to duplicate or displace or to compete with or to clone, this asset, which is unlike steel or silicon chips or motor cars or electronics of all kinds, a piece of sardonic irony that while the Japanese are unable to duplicate the American films by flank assault, they can destroy it by video cassette recorder. And this is a sort of famous turning point in the conversation on intellectual property, because Jack Valenti was really trying to mobilize American sentiments about copying, about technology development in East Asia, and also about the film industry. And I would argue that these have produced a set of sentiments that have facilitated particular kinds of gatekeeping. So I just want to make a couple of concluding points here. The intellectual property law is not only a story about America as a nation, what its value is in terms of innovativeness, in terms of invention. It is a story about identity trauma. And I put identity trauma instead of racial trauma because I think Professor Saeed's pointing to some really important elements here. There are also class elements. There's also the problem that we have sort of offered people of color the opportunity to address, to repair harm through the same structures that created that harm. And so I think that's something worth reflecting on. The emotional impulses that underlie intellectual property are discussed, as I said, as drivers of policy, that they perpetuate what Brian Fry might call intellectual property landlordism. Valenti's narrative here creates a sense of entitlement, right? In that case, it's white American entitlement against the Japanese, resentment at competition, anxiety about loss, and this idea that Japanese people are inferior, right? They're not as creative. And so here, intellectual property infringement becomes a national racial trauma that engenders bipartisan support for ever increasing propertization, in contrast to those communal responses that Professor Saeed was raising. So here's a picture from Gone with the Wind, which is implicated in that case, SunTrust Bank versus Houghton Mifflin. So gate opening, I would argue, requires thinking about those exclusionary narratives and the emotions that underlie them, and thinking about how we shift public feelings of entitlement to knowledge, to a more communal path, to thinking about just compensation through restorative frameworks instead of carceral ones, and making space for cultural plurality as opposed to singular approaches to intellectual property. And here's just a snapshot of restorative justice practices and outcomes in contrast to those carceral ones. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Professor Votz. That was, again, incredibly rich, impossible to address in the short time that we have. But your metaphors are deep and deeply rooted in Foucault and going back to an incredibly rich lineage as well. But I think it is very interesting to us, what are the origin stories that we want to look at? And I think, as we've seen from Professor Goodman's speech and from some of the examples that Professor Saeed raised, it's grounding these in the examples of, yes, lived experience, and also the experience of creators and innovators that will help us, I think, so much move this set of inquiry forward. And I really think that Professor Mulrain, who has spent his life and his work delving so deeply into those works, is, I have to use this word wise. You are wise, Professor Mulrain, and you will bring to us your perspective. And I stand in awe of you, so I cannot wait to hear you speak. Please.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. You know, one of the reasons I think that I was attracted to a career in academia, my dad was actually a professor, but I never thought for 1 minute about going into the family business. And now that I'm in the family business, I have a daughter who is a 2L who wants to be a law professor. So I guess we're going to continue this path. But one of the reasons why I went into this field is because I love learning. You know, I enjoy learning so much, and I want to give some honor to the speakers from this morning, because I've learned quite a bit in these last 15, 20 minutes. You guys have been awesome. I'm going to talk about, you know, my area is music and entertainment, both as a performer, as a creator, as a writer, as a producer. I do all of that on the artistic side. And then on the business side and the academic side, that's what I teach. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on. But a thought came to mind that is outside of what my prepared remarks were. And I think it was stimulated by something that Professor Sarid said in his presentation. And it just made this click in my mind, and that is record companies and the other corporate entities in the IP and entertainment intersection benefit from their artists' lack of education, lack of knowledge, and lack of understanding. So that wasn't even in my remarks, but I just thought I'd share that because, you know, you guys have stimulated me to think about that this morning. IP rights are tightly interwoven into entertainment contracts and relationships between artists and corporate entities. Historically, the balance of power between artists and corporate entities has been anything but balanced. Today, my comments are focused on the silver lining, shifting power in the music industry, artists of color recognizing their value in the streaming economy and the streaming ecosystem, removing some of the gatekeeping that previously kept power and control out of reach for many artists of color. So gatekeepers, of course, can be a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they have an outsized influence in setting the agenda for art consumption, and much of that agenda is driven by factors that are other than artistic merit. On the other hand, gatekeepers allow us to reduce the cacophony that can exist when everyone is speaking at the same time. Gatekeepers in the music industry, record labels, and radio stations have historically acted like shepherds, with the commercial audience being their sheep. Often their marketing and promotion and their choices on what they will market and promote has had an outsized impact on what young artists actually create. Case in point is the transition that was made in the rap music industry from the late 80s into the early 90s. Somewhat of a controversial topic, but the norm for late 80s artists was culturally impactful, often commenting upon and impacting social justice. That was the norm for many of the hip hop artists in the late 80s. One needs only to look at the music of Public Enemy with Fight the Power and their album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. Artists such as KRS-One, Poor Righteous Teachers, Dead Prez, and several others. But this music was too powerful and had far too much influence for positive change to be allowed through the gates for too long and enter the jarring, almost instantaneous shift in the style of music from the late 80s to the early 90s that really set the table for so much of what we hear today, as record labels began to demand and began to reject the diversity of thought that we had, I think, at that time. One of the main problems back then was that the artists were always beholden to record companies. It took thousands of dollars to make even a low-budget record. And of course, there was no chance that an indie artist could get a song on mainstream radio in a major city. That's the bad news. But over the past 20 years, shifts in the costs of recording technology, as well as the actual templates for producing music, have served to democratize the music industry. Now, don't mistake me. Record companies are still needed if an artist wants to get onto mainstream radio, or if an artist wants to be a global superstar. Labels have the resources to make that happen, but artists no longer need record labels to make records. Many artists have no interest in major labels if they will have to give away creative control and ownership of their masters, which was demanded of artists for the last 70 years. This growing trend has served to nudge record labels to make deals that are more fair to artists. For example, controlled composition clauses are starting to fade away. Often these new deals allow for net revenue sharing and artists being able to retain or share in the ownership of their masters. Record labels today serve two main functions. They serve as banks and they serve as marketing companies. And these are the two things that many indie artists have struggled with in the past. However, the typical modern artist does not need the record label to actually create the music or the recordings. So many are producing hit records in their bedrooms. Of course, Billie Eilish and her brother Phineas famously did this, but it all started with modern hip hop artists. These artists, as early as the 90s, jumped in with both feet into the DIY system, making recordings and duplicating them on CDs and then selling the product from their trunks or at their shows. The artists would love to have a partner for artist development, but so little of that is done by modern major labels that this is no longer something an indie artist misses out on by staying independent. Much of that work is done by artist managers today. In addition to the DIY music making model, hip hop and R&B artists have blazed the trail to entrepreneurial ventures, including record labels, fashion empires, and diversification into other areas of entertainment and sports. This is in fact not a totally new phenomenon. Black artists and entrepreneurs from the 60s, such as Sam Cooke and Berry Gordy, and the 70s, Curtis Mayfield, Gamble and Huff, and others, were breaking ground in this area 50 plus years ago. In the 80s, Prince followed suit with Energy Records and Paisley Park Studios, and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis created Flight Time, and of course, L.A. Reid and Babyface with their uber successful LaFace Records. The 90s brought Dallas Austin's Rowdy Records, Eazy-E's Ruthless Records, and Jermaine Dupri's So So Def, and of course, Sean Combs' Bad Boy Entertainment, among others. Today, standing on those recording company entrepreneurs' shoulders are the likes of Rihanna with her Fenty fashion brand. Rihanna, of course, has crossed the threshold into billionaire status, largely by virtue of that success. Sean Combs with his Sean John fashion, Jay-Z with Rockefeller, Rockaware, Rock Nation Sports, and Tidal. Timbaland and Swiss Beats with Versus, Kanye West with his fashion and entertainment holdings, and many others. Many artists have a presence on radio or podcasts and build their brands to generate multiple streams of income. Building those streams of income creates a level of independence that artists did not necessarily have when they were completely relying on the traditional system, which, as I started off saying, kind of traded on lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. Last but not least, the industry transition that has had the biggest impact on removing the gatekeepers, or at least shifting the gate a bit, is the transition from a physical product-driven industry to the streaming industry. Gone are the days when record labels could pretend their Black artists were not making the massive cultural or commercial impact. The digital footprint has taken away those shenanigans. And by shenanigans, let me say that I studied radio, TV, and film in college, and my internship was at WKYS, the #1 station at the time in DC. And part of my job was every week we had to call all of the record stores. There was a thing called record stores back then. And we'd have to call them and get a list for what their top 20 selling records were of the week, albums and singles. And to a large degree, that's how the charts were made up back then. Well, obviously, there's a huge possibility for manipulation when the system is based on people just reporting, here's what sold this week. And there were a lot of shenanigans that went on with that. Now with the digital footprint, it's much more difficult to do that sort of thing. So you cannot deny the number of streams that an artist of color gets, or someone who's making a change to the status quo. As streaming has surpassed the importance of terrestrial radio to a large degree. The gatekeepers at radio can no longer control what the fans actually hear. Perhaps this new balance in the industry will lead to a more diverse musical message where artists can again be comfortable creating art that impacts social justice and moves the culture in a positive direction and benefiting from that creation. Thank you.
So Professor Mulrain, it sounds like what you're talking about is artists of color, particularly African-American AVE artists, harnessing IP and really sort of using it in sort of broad scale, many different levels, right? To own different points at in the course of production, right? From the inception of the song to the commercialization of it. But you're really saying they're operating within a fairly traditional IP framework, if that's what I'm understanding, right? And then diversifying in ownership of other kinds of properties like Rihanna's Fenty, which is just concrete goods too. So, I think the strategy that you're pointing to is, one that we suggested, but it's in some ways diverges from Professor Sareed's and Vats's idea of, moving away from the IP paradigm. Do you see within the African-American artistic community, especially the musical community that you're talking about, a desire to sort of say, now we want to own the tools and own the master's house and take over his house traditionally, right? By sort of grabbing hold of these instruments to consolidate our power and our commercial weight?
Absolutely. I think the way you described it is on point. The house has always been built by these artists, but they weren't allowed to own it. Now they're saying, okay, well, at the very least, I want to jointly own the house with you. What I really want is for me to own it completely. And this is a phenomenon that a lot of these younger artists are taking on now. They're saying, look, wait a minute. So you want to give me an advance that I'm going to have to completely pay back before you pay me any royalties. And then after I pay back, you're still going to own it? That doesn't make sense, right? Because I bought a car, and when I paid off the car, I owned it. I bought a house, or my parents bought a house, and when they paid off the house, they owned it. You're telling me that after I pay off the record, you're going to still own it? That doesn't work for me anymore. And so that's what a lot of these artists are recognizing.
Sounds a little bit like academia, but we're not going to go there because but let me ask you about sampling. Sampling was shut down pretty much, right? Or at least there was major attempts to sort of stop this incredibly creative practice. And do you think that artists of color, African-American artists who now are beginning to own some of the levers are going to say, hey, let's make more room for this? I mean, this actually came from our community first, right? Do you think they're going to change how they approach sampling, or is it going to sort of stay the same? Yeah, you got to license it.
Yeah, the shutting down, as you refer to it, really came from a top-down approach, right? The labels were the ones who attempted to shut it down. The artists never had a problem with it. Even the artists who are being sampled, the George Clintons of the world, love when people sample and build on their music. I think there's got to be a balance between allowing sampling to occur and allowing the original creators of the original works to benefit from the new works. But I don't see a license will not be needed for sampling. But I do think there might be a shift in how those licenses are granted. Maybe something closer to a compulsory license, not exactly a compulsory, but something a little closer to a compulsory license.
Right. Right. Again, could be the change of norms and practices, IP analogs, as our conference likes to call it, right? That could drive the change. I'm going to ask a question that was asked in the chat, and I'm going to leave it open to everyone because I think the question sort of, in some ways, offers its own answer. It's from Jason Guthrie, and he says, how important is it for artists themselves to understand how copyright and IP works? Do you see artists taking more responsibility for the aspects of the business they used to leave to the lawyers? What role can educators play in training future artists? And Jason, I'm sorry, I just have to jump in here and say, I taught at Emerson College for 4 years in a program called the Business of Creative Enterprise. and I taught a course on copyright and creativity, and I also taught a course on cultural appropriation. And my sort of evangelism was, you guys are going to go work in creative industries. Some of you will be creatives yourself. Some of you will support creatives and innovators. And how is it not possible that you must understand this? But I will leave this question open to panelists as well. Would anyone care to jump in on this?
I'm happy to start on that. I do think it's very important for artists to understand. And the most recent article that I had published really was kind of built off of that concept. Bhamidi, I might have already told you about this. I might have spoken about this at the last time we were together, but I had a friend that I knew from my college days who has become a very, very successful gospel artist. Anyone who's in the gospel field knows this person through their successful records. And I contacted him maybe a year or two ago to congratulate him on all of his older product now being available on streaming, because it wasn't on the platforms for a while. And when I contacted him, I just said in passing, have you started working on your copyright terminations? And his response to me was, please explain that to me. So before we got to the please explain that to me phase, I went back and looked at his catalog and charted everything out. And his first album had already missed the deadline for termination. And I was just, broken up that here's an artist who doesn't even know that he has this right. And now it's too late to exercise this right. And that's really problematic. So I do think we do have a role as educators. We have a role as attorneys. We have a role as anyone who has a voice in the creative fields to let them know about their rights and how copyrighted IP can affect. I often tell students when I'm preparing them for going out into working in the field, someone doesn't need to hire an attorney to go do a gig for $100 at the local club, right? Even if you should have made 1,000 and you make 100, you live to see another day. But it becomes an issue where you are now affecting your long-term rights. And that's where IP comes in, copyright and granting rights to someone, and you no longer have those rights. That's when it becomes problematic. So I'll stop and let someone else jump in.
Yeah, I think sometimes even at the beginning, when you need to know what rights you want to preserve and what rights you don't want to necessarily preserve, because copyright also and IP gives us the choice.
Yes.
Right? So you don't even know that it's a choice at the beginning. You need to know that you can choose. And there's a lot of different ways that you can choose, right? You don't have to choose to claim ownership. I tell my students that you figure out for yourself, what model do you want? You can give stuff away. That is totally cool. That's dope. But know what you're giving away and what you're holding, right?
And you have to be the one giving it away.
That's right. That's right. So a lot different. It's a lot different feeling when you are pulling the levers of power and you are the ones doing the choosing, right? We can all agree on that.
Absolutely.
And that in some senses takes us back to that question of Vogue, Professor Sarid, right? I mean, the gay community included Madonna in a lot of ways and respected her. I think she really did not come in as an outsider swooping in to claim stuff in some super colonial power grab move. She was in fact pretty active in the community, but she was also partaking of it, and the rules that enabled her to participate didn't mean that she got to take, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is part of kind of the I would say the tension of where the kind of educating and making, creators aware of their rights versus, kind of not wanting to disrupt this very, very delicate ecosystem that they have going on. And as Professor Moraine was speaking, one of the things that came to my mind was I've been doing field work with drag queens for over 10 years now. And it is very interesting for me. Every time I come, they're like, what do you want from us? You're an IP lawyer. And then these conversations start, and it's super interesting. And drag queens are the most colorful people to engage with. And I think when I think about, when we start talking about what IP means for them and copyright means for them, I think there are two levels here. The first is fear. They hear law, they hear IP, they are afraid. all they think about is, oh, someone's going to sue me. Oh, or like I'm imitating Madonna. I'm impersonating another, Dua Lipa or someone. I'm going to get sued. So that's kind of the first thing. The first of all is like, let's unpack this. Why are you afraid? And then they're like, oh, we have no rights. We were impersonating someone, we're using someone else's music. I was like, well, actually, you have a lot of rights, and we have fair dealing in the UK or fair use in the US, and you need to think about these things as well. And your licensing, you're using licensed music. And then the third element is other externals. So, if drag queens go and perform in a club or something, they enter into a contractual agreement with the club owners. And again, they're so afraid of pursuing the rights sometimes, or standing their rights even. People use their image all the time. They're like, oh, but I don't own my image. I was like, well, maybe you do. And getting them to think about these things, not necessarily asserting them, because again, there's a very delicate ecosystem there that we should be aware of when we think of, accessibility and what that might mean for a community. And we don't want to push too much law in that direction, because law does have certain implications for those communities. But on the other hand, when we're thinking about, communities of color and communities of certain other backgrounds, economic backgrounds, gay community, queer community, because the way the law is structured, part of empowerment to these communities is say, hey, you should assert your IP rights against those who are appropriating you. And Madonna is a great example, because on the one hand, she was such a great advocate for gay rights and queer rights back in the 90s, where it wasn't that popular. But on the other hand, maybe unknowingly, it created kind of like this, this hierarchy that maybe she didn't want to create, but the law creates. And that makes us also, again, think about the tools that the law might give creators when we think about accessibility.
Well, I think the fact that she was a white woman also helped create some, societal inequities from the get-go. But speaking to your point about drag queens, I really think that with the exploitation on all ends of the political spectrum of drag queens, the way that they have been brought into prominence, whether they want to or not, sometimes yes, sometimes no, it becomes even more important for them to be able to base their sense of identity in something positive and rich and affirming, right? I mean, the whole point
Absolutely.
was affirming, and that this brings me back so much to Professor Watts, of course, to your point about the inscription of fear in the language and in the tropes of IP, right? The embedding of this idea that I can't because, rather than the way I personally look at IP is you can because. But your point, Professor Watts, is in the language of IP is also you can't, right? And you can't, not only you can't infringe upon my rights, but can you even assert your own rights, right? The fear of asserting your own rights is also a real carceral fear, I think. So Professor Watts, that metaphor strikes, I think, on so many levels.
Yeah, I mean, this is for me very complicated, and I like to remind people we can do the both and, right? Like, we're grown people, we can do two things at the same time and think two opposing things at the same time. So we can say, the mode of enforcing our rights or monetizing that's available to us has not been just. And we can also say, as a structure, this is probably not a thing that we want for the long term, right? And so I think what we're doing is what we need to do for creators is create a balance there. So, to this question of how important it is for artists to understand copyright and IP, I just gave a talk last week where I was talking about intellectual property as civil right and the intersections between civil rights and intellectual property. And so I think one of the things that education has not involved that is useful for creators is to say, hey, if we were talking about other civil rights, we were talking about freedom of speech, if we were talking about search and seizure, you would educate yourself about that, right? And so I think the tide is turning in part due to social media and in part due to what somebody in this question in the chat box has asked about, areas that are driven by emotion. There's greater focus on intellectual property and its centrality and its relationship to rights, to civil rights, to race, and so on. But as someone earlier said, you can't know what path you want to choose until you know the options. And so, I want to just co-sign that, because a lot of artists don't know their options. And just had a piece come out a couple weeks ago on Taylor Swift and sort of the white appropriation of ownership of master records, which we had a great history of, right? And in Lauren Mulrain's talk. But there's a long history of ownership as civil rights in African American communities. And so building on that, educating creators about that, understanding how racial identities can interface in this area, I think is really important. And part of the work I'm doing right now is I'm building a public platform to help address these sorts of narratives, because I think a lot of creators don't know, and a lot of times they learn these about these issues when they get on social media and they're like, oh, someone stole my TikTok dance, or someone stole my, Instagram posts, or Taylor Swift is doing the same thing that Prince was doing in 1980, whatever, right? And that there is just this constant stream of appropriation. So I'm enthusiastic, yes, on educating creators. I think a lot of this is very mediatized and emotion driven in this moment, partly because we have so much visibility. So that makes it a good time to do this.
Yeah, I want to just let the audience know that this is in part in response to Chris Bennett's question: is the gatekeeping impact amplified in IP areas that are directly or indirectly driven by emotion, i.e. copyright is creative expression like songs? I just don't see how it can't be driven by emotions. We create, we innovate, what we do when we write, when we paint, when we sing, when whatever it is that we do, when we create a hair product, is we give, right? We give of ourselves. And sometimes it's like that old cliche, it does feel like opening a vein, but how can that not be an emotional act? I think the heart of IP is emotion. And I think when people deprecate that emotion, they do disservice to it, actually, right? We try to treat it as this neutral, legal, law. Law is law. But it's deeply emotion driven. So I saw a play last night called Prima Facie, and I've been dying to see it. It's about a woman who's a district attorney who handles rape cases and advocates fiercely as a defense lawyer until she herself is a victim of sexual assault and sees it from a different point of view, right? I think for us, it's not as big a switch because we are all people who come into the IP space. I think we have all of us creative bones, innovative impulses, creative impulses in us. And they're often deeply emotional because art, creativity, culture, all this stuff is embedded with emotion. Creating hair products for fellow African Americans is a deeply giving act, right, Professor Goodman? It has to have an emotional quality to it, I would assume, although please tell us, because you're the master of this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I think it's a giving act, but I don't think it's necessarily a selfless act. I think that just because society benefits off of something, and even if that is your primary focus, you see a need, you fill your need, or in the case of being creative, you have a need and you want to be creative and you want to share that creativity with others. At the same time, I don't think that because your act is not selfless, or if your act is selfless, I don't think that that means that you should get any more or less intellectual property rights because of it. Even though my entire work centers around diversity, equity, inclusion, and intellectual property, I don't think that somebody should get more or less rights because something is a public benefit. I think that that's something that we should be more concentrating on in terms of incentive structures. But I think that once you look at this as a giving institution and a incentivized, a monetized and incentivized structure, because you're giving somebody their rights to credit, their rights to control their product, the rights to exclude others for a certain amount of time. I think that once that's put in place, we're recognizing that we're encouraging that giving process. through that incentive structure. And I think that's really the beauty of all intellectual property that we have, is that there's no real fixed tangible medium that we're necessarily putting out into the world. And yet we are still giving back with our government structure and with kind of licensing fees and everything else. We're still giving back to that person for putting their idea that can be used by others into the world.
Well, I'm deeply committed to writing and thinking and talking about gender as well as race. And I always find it fascinating that the trope of giving, selflessly giving, comes up when you talk about women's work, right? But you give, you're supposed to give. You're a mom, a parent, a woman, a person who cooks for people, who cares. I cook for people. It's an act of giving. It's an act of selflessness. It's an act of love. Right. If I cook in a restaurant, I don't. I mean, of course I can cook with love, but exactly to your point, right? Sharing is giving, but it's not giving selflessly. And it's not necessarily giving without saying, this has value. Now, there's different ways to measure value, right? People love food and they value your cooking, but they also many times expressing value by paying for it is an important part. Does it make it purely transactional? Well, in some ways it might, but in other ways, those transactions show a certain way of conferring value. And it's not a way that I necessarily have to be forced to eschew or to say from the start, hey, my work is just so worth things to people. And it's, I just want to give it, right? Choosing to give away, especially for someone like me who I grew up with very little money. And to me, I give when I feel like I can, when most of us do. But I also feel like I have to put food on the table. And I sort of tend to go back to the roots of IP law to say, this was a way, Professor Mulrain, for artists to put food on the table, right? Owning rights in your work. Why do creators of color care so much about owning the means of production, the mechanisms of production, every step of the way? Because that empowers. It enfranchises rather than disenfranchises. And I think that's a really important part of this story. I want to go to a couple of the questions. Chris Bennett asks, Professors Mulrain and Sarid and Vats, do you think that IP can be further democratized by 1, raising awareness, 2, providing access to IP that meets people where they are, 3, affordability, 4, availability of a return on investment in the artist's terms?
I think this is what we call a leading question. Yes, I would say yes to all of these. For me, democratization is part of the goal, and then reworking the system is the goal. I've already spoken about awareness. I just think, even when I started law school, like back in the early aughts, 20 years ago, intellectual property was this weird thing that people didn't know about. And now that we have social media, creators are more empowered and they have more language to talk about these questions, but there's still a lot of education to be done. And so I think that awareness gives people choices and agency that they did not have. And I am always for that. I am always for education. I'm always for agency. And I'm always for having multiple frameworks, right? So when I have conversations now with folks and they say, well, how do I protect my intellectual property? I say, well, what are your politics? You can register this with the Copyright Office and you can try to hunt down everybody that copies your academic ideas, but is that what you want to do? Do you want to be policing your Instagram all the time, right? Or do you want to make peace with the sharing of those ideas in different ways? And if you're salaried, that's a different conversation than if you're not. But the point here is that it's not, I don't think the situation is as cut and dry as just go to the Copyright Office, register, or go to the Patent Office, register, and then call it a day, right? We all know that there is enforcement behind legal regimes. So raising awareness, yes, and providing access, yes, but that meeting people where they are part, I think, is where we can have more conversation. What does it mean to meet people where they are? And what does it mean to create an availability of a return on investment, right? People have to eat. That is like the bottom line, as you were saying, but there are different paths to make sure people eat, right? And so I think that we can both raise awareness and create access and also say, hey, we need to also think about whether maybe we should just be salarying creators. Maybe we should be thinking about new ways of compensating people. Maybe we should have a living wage, right? Like there's different paths to get at this same question.
Absolutely. And I want to tie this back to something that I think Professor Goodman raised earlier. It came up in more than one talk, which is cultural competency. And I think that's such an important part of this equation, right? So Professor Goodman, I was wondering, do you think that the ABA updating some of these professional responsibility rules, requiring schools to teach cultural competency more specifically, will that help with these issues? I mean, how do we sort of update knowledge within the PTO and within the Copyright Office, which I think are doing some creditable efforts, but I feel like perhaps they could use us to help sort of move this forward, these deep-rooted institutions. I'm curious as to what you think about that.
Yeah, well, first I want to commend the United States Patent and Trademark Office for their diversity initiatives. I know that Colleen Chen and Margot Bagley and so many others, Lisa Willett, have really led the way there. And there's Bismarck. There are so many people at the United States Patent and Trademark Office who are incredibly committed to this work. So I just want to say that they're doing wonderfully. I think that there are rules that the ABA is putting forward to at least acknowledge that there are problems. I don't know if rules from the ABA help. Here's why. I think that if you put out a rule, a lot of people try to just do the bare minimum to meet that rule, rather than exploring how this might necessarily impact them and their practice and how they can be the best that they can be. I think that encouraging schools, I think that encouraging institutions to grapple with this is important, but I don't want people to pay lip service to such an important endeavor. I don't want to see, these diversity statements that don't really mean very much because they feel like they can just slap it on and go about their day and not actually commit to that work. I also think that it's incredibly important. I was speaking about this in another panel. It's incredibly important to understand that every time that we make the economic case for diversity, we're telling people at the top that they can still build their business on the back of women and people of color. And it's still going to be okay. And they're still going to be able to economically benefit from this. And it is not a discussion that centers women and people of color to be empowered. And so if there are rules that discuss the importance of cultural competency, I do not want them to be written in a way that says this will still serve the majority, but instead starts actually centering the people who have been disenfranchised and not treated equitably in the system. So those are all the caveats that I have for putting the ABA rule, if it does exist. And I think that it's important to understand that if we have that rule, we have to come with those nuances. But if we don't have that rule, then we have this really wonderful opportunity for us as a community to come together and make rules for ourselves. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad opportunity to take.
I think that's an incredibly important point. And it speaks in part too to what Professor Street, what you were saying about sort of who's central, right? Who gets centralized and who gets marginalized and who gets to define what the center is and who gets to define what the terms are. And you use that word again, belonging, that always haunts me, because when you're not at the center, you're always made to feel that you sort of belong. We're thinking about you now. Gee, thanks, right? But we're not centering you in some meaningful way so that, hey, here, have this little morsel right on the slide. And you talked about sort of communities, entire communities, right? The queer community coming together and building a very strong movement and voice and saying, not just we must be heard, but we must be placed at the center of this discussion. And do you have any suggestions of sort of strategies that communities can do to ensure that their voices get amplified and centered like that?
Thanks. I think this is a great question, because it really does open up to, IP law versus IP policy and IP practice, and what we, grassroots communities or academics or anyone who's interested can do to change things. And sometimes changing the laws, not sometimes, always changing the law is a very hard endeavor. But social norms and communities coming together can have a huge impact, especially today, with social media and other platforms that we didn't have in the past. And I think, that was part of what we heard earlier from the commentators. And I can give a brief example of something. I get an email one day from a curator in a museum here in the UK asking me, how can we incorporate queer perspectives into showing queer art in the museum? And I was, we started a conversation. I said, just a question. Have you reached out to the community, to people in your communities in South End? It's in South Essex, somewhere in the UK. It's like, I'm very happy to give my, academic ivory tower perspectives, but talk to the people you're actually using their works. Talk to the communities who have been doing this for years. They will tell you how they want to be presented. They need to be a part of this conversation if this conversation is ever to happen. And again, we can talk about law as much as we like, but these are the things that create the change. So I think this is one very important point. The other very important point in this regard that I just kind of want to very quickly touch upon is sometimes we look at a certain pool and we tend to forget that there are people who don't even enter the pool. I had a conversation, a really interesting conversation, Professor Goodman, this kind of relates to what you were talking about with an economist from the US Patent Office. They were telling me about, why don't we ever, we were talking about gender and how many, women get to patent their inventions. And he said, what is your queer perspectives on this? And I was like, you're looking into the pool and you're saying, we have, 80% men, 20% women. But you also need to think about the people who don't even have access to the pool and how we create access to that pool. And this also relates a little bit to the point of meeting people where they are. We need to meet people where they are. And again, to give them the tools if they want to pursue these things. Again, keeping in mind that we need to be very careful about how we present things, because we don't want to, kind of disrupt the way communities want to kind of express themselves.
And of course, the less diverse the pool is, the less attractive it is to diverse people.
Absolutely. But also, Professor Mulroney, I was just going to reach out to you and say this, I think it's heartening in a way, the way that people of color, that marginalized communities are, in fact, also banging on the door saying, our turn to be heard, right? So it's not just an act of waiting to be asked as usual, and then sort of getting that perfunctory ask eventually, right? And I'm not saying by any stretch that the Patent and Trademark Office or the Copyright Office have done that. They've actually been, I agree with you, Professor Goodman, they've made some incredible strides, and I definitely think change has occurred. ADA, okay, conversation for another day. But artists of color, minority artists, queer artists saying, our voice must be heard. Indigenous people saying, our voice. How there was a question in the Q&A that I want to interrupt myself by responding to and also raising, right? How does the idea of intellectual property rights as civil rights square with Indigenous legal orders, where the concept of ownership is either rejected or holds a very different meaning? Again, it's critical to me, and I'm we had a panel on Indigenous voices yesterday, and that is certainly not the be all and end all. We need to have Indigenous people speaking up and saying, this is how we want to do this, right? Because I agree with you so much, Professor Butts, it is a civil rights question. That is an incredibly powerful and important analogy to make, but how civil rights has played out very differently for very different peoples. We can't impose the template of the way that African-American musicians, just for one example, have chosen to wield IP and say, this is our template now for oppressed peoples. Cannot be one size fits all, right? So that it's an incredibly important question. Does anyone want to address how, any thoughts on Indigenous people's cultural heritage? Because I know I do not feel equipped to do that.
That's not my area, but I do think something that Professor Rand's or Attorney Rand's question leads to is the concept of sort of a Creative Commons kind of approach, right? Where the person who creates can say, I don't want to stop others from using this, but you sort of enter into an agreement that you won't take it either, right? So if you're talking about indigenous communities saying, we reject the system of ownership, they should also have the right to say, but you can't take it and say you own it. You can't now take this thing and monetize it as your own because I'm not doing it either. I think that's a thought. It's not necessarily a deeply academic thought, but that comes to mind at this point.
I can chime in there. I think that Professor Mulrain is making a great point there about Creative Commons as a starting point. I also think the panel yesterday made some important points about what it means to bring indigenous cosmologies was in the title of that panel. But, there was one of the panelists made a distinction between the on the ground conversation versus the legal conversation that I think we've been talking a little bit about here. I would say there's no substitute for people of color making their, for us as people in positions of power listening, and for those people to advocate for themselves. And so the question is, how do we bring those groups together? And I think this is also what Professor Sarid was talking about, right? Maybe actually interface with the people in the community and ask them what they need, and if they want you to advocate, right? So I think that that's one step when you're talking about traditional knowledge. India is a really interesting example on this front because they have created this traditional knowledge digital library. And to Professor Goodman's point, one of the conversations that happened with this traditional knowledge digital library was around Ayurveda, was around traditional medicine, and how patent offices didn't have the language or the cultural knowledge to interface with those traditional medicines because they weren't legible, right? And so they were granting these patents on turmeric, on neem. These are sort of the classic examples that ignored all these thousands of years in some cases of traditional knowledge, right? So part of this is a cultural competency question. Part of it is a listening question. Part of it is, stepping back sometimes and saying, okay, yes, you're right. This is not a one size fits all question. And then the last thing I would say is that it's also a cosmopolitanism question. It's also about recognizing that U.S. frameworks don't apply everywhere. That there is also this sort of deeply American understanding of race that doesn't translate in other places. So I'm in the UK right now, and the language of race is so very different. It's different in New Zealand. It's different, in the Caribbean. And so thinking about how we can sort of have organic systems of knowledge ownership and knowledge management. And I like that phrase, knowledge management, or, knowledge regimes, because I think it allows for greater multiplicity of approaches. I would say that those are some of the ways that we can start to think about how to interface with not only indigenous knowledge, but other countries, right? And other places where other people have expertise.
Absolutely. And someone mentioned in the chat, Martha Rance says the concept is stewardship of artworks. And I think your knowledge management and artistic, cultural, and knowledge stewardship, which does mean very different things in very different cultures. And I think we can be sensitive to those ideas too, that the idea that you are the steward of a culture greater than just you. Yoga, the tradition of India, right, doesn't belong to someone, in part because it's our cultural heritage, but also we yoginis, we're stewards of, right? Stewardship means something very different. And I think that you're absolutely right, Professor Rotz. We have this very American-centric view of how we view things like race, class, caste. I taught the book Caste, and one of the things that I found challenging about teaching it is I personally felt she didn't really understand caste in India, and sort of imposed the metaphor upon an American system of race and class that doesn't map, right? So I come from an Indian American heritage background, family, and I'm first gen. And, my parents sort of taught us that, we're sort of past caste, we're in a post-caste world, right? Great, sure. Easy to say when you're Brahmin, sure. But on the other hand, right, I have a understanding of caste that's pretty, rooted in my ethnic origin, my background, my family, my people, right? And I look at how people use that term. It's great to use it casually, like a different caste than me. I'm a Boston Brahmin. I am a Boston Brahmin. Just want everyone to know that. But it's a ridiculous term because these things don't map. And we do injustices, but we also start building in systemic inequities as we make these terms sort of kind of quasi sort of fit. And I think this is the problem that you were talking about, Professor Vats, with respect to sort of patenting of name, turmeric, things that made sense in the order in which they were used, and all of a sudden get transposed into the American patent system with some kinds of odd gaps and some losses. I want to ask one more question to you guys. We have a couple minutes left. One of the things we haven't talked about is sort of the communities that we're trying to get access of our works to. What a poorly constructed sentence. Let me try that one again, right? But our users, our public, our consumers, are the people who take and use and do things with and love and appreciate and need access to these works. I think norms are changing within those communities as well. And I want us to also think about foregrounding, and I wonder if you guys think this too, more the voices of people from the user base, for lack of a better word, from the public, right? When I hear my students talk about cultural appropriation, what Taylor Swift's doing, Professor Vats, means a lot to them in some ways. And they're saying, go woman, right? Now, my African-American students might say like, go woman, but go really rich white woman. And gee, isn't it a rich white woman who's doing this again? Great. But some of them are saying, hey, Rihanna should do this, or whomever has been. I don't think Rihanna's a great example because I don't think she was as exploited from the get-go, right? But there are a slew of African-American artists who have been exploited. They should go do this. Jaquel Knight has made an argument that he should do this in dance choreography, right? Successfully copyrighted some of his dances. So how do we sort of let those voices bubble up as well? How do we sort of create space to listen to what our users are saying about IP? Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas on that?
I can try. I mean, I think this is so thought-provoking that I kind of caught us all in the moment, kind of reflecting on the idea of users. And users are a very powerful tool, both in terms of how they impact the social norms and the communities that they are part of, how they keep up with certain practices that are practiced in those communities, and also, as you mentioned, how they make, or how we help them make their voices heard. Because again, when we think of intellectual property, we tend to think of creators versus infringers. Users are so important. They are the end users of all this material, and their voices sometimes kind of like not part of the discussions. When we say the public, who is the public? The public is also these users, and thinking of ways. I mean, this is just opening my mind to thoughts. I don't think I have a concrete answer, but we as academics, as practitioners, judges, need to think also of how we make the public heard. And one of the interesting things I think is creators have a lot of direct conversations with their users. They interact on different forums, they interact through social media. This is one of the best feedbacks that creators can actually get, not through royalties or monetization, but through kind of direct engagement. And I think we need to think of ways to kind of empower this direct relationship between the people who use the intellectual goods and the people who create them, and how they can come together to, think of better ways to create this kind of direct relationship. But again, just initial thoughts on a very thought-provoking question.
I'll add just one thing, which is, we're in this moment where there's this interesting collapse of users and consumers, right? Like we're all producers and consumers now. So the conversation has shifted from like 1985 when you went and bought your cassette tapes. Though I hear Harry Styles is bringing cassette tapes back, so good times. The thing I want to say is my favorite example of watching consumers sort of shape or users shape the conversation actually comes out of the traditional knowledge digital library example. And there were a couple of interviews I read of just like they were just interviews of like artists and consumers, and they were like, well, mostly Indian folks talking about how we need cultural patents, right? And so there were cultural patents that was like copyright heritage, just like this mishmash of intellectual property words. And of course, the lawyers are like, you can't put those words together, right? But what I want to highlight there is that we have the opportunity to listen to what users are talking about and watch them and observe them interface with these medias in ways we did not before. And I think that can help shape the conversations. It can help to change the value systems that animate intellectual property. And there is a real opportunity in remix culture to draw on that sort of classic idea to help us to essentially create more inclusive values. And that's what I would advocate for, to say, hey, let's look at users and consumers. Let's see what they're doing with the media. Let's think about those questions. And then let's see how we can change these systems to be more egalitarian.
I completely agree. And I think, again, changing language too, right? These dichotomies between, user and infringer, or, infringer and, using as a building block versus creating with it. We've created, again, IP has these words, this language that I think polarizes and describes and doesn't do justice to the richness of creation, right? And of use and interaction and exchange. So I see Sandra, and I know that we're out of time, and I just want to thank you all so much for a wonderful, rich discussion that could have lasted at least another 3 hours, but then we would have had to serve drinks as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Sandra, for allowing us this space to have this exciting conversation.